The brain grows in connections made between the nerve cells, or neurons, in addition to growth in size and volume. Scientists estimate that the brain is making around 1 million new neural connections per second in the first few years of life. Neurons communicate with one another by sending nerve impulses from one neuron to another, forming long chains. These chains eventually create complex networks. The more often the chains of neurons communicate, the stronger the chain becomes, making faster, stronger networks that pass information between areas of the brain. The experiences that young children have in the world stimulate the neurons to communicate with each other, forming connections. So the experiences we provide young children are literally helping to develop their brains. Let's look at a neuron, learn about its parts, and how it communicates with other neurons. At one end of the neuron is a cell body with hair-like extensions. These hair-like extensions are called dendrites. Their job is to be available to bring in signals called neurotransmitters from neighboring cells. Once the dendrite receives the messages from a neighboring cell, it triggers the cell body to create a nerve impulse, kind of like an electric current. This impulse travels down the long tail of the neuron called the axon to the other end of the neuron. At the other end of the neuron are the axon terminals. The nerve impulse tells the axon terminals to release or not to release little message packages, which are called neurotransmitters. To reach the next neuron, the neurotransmitters must cross a tiny, tiny space called the synapse. The neurotransmitters cross the synapse to the dendrites of the next nerve cell. The neurotransmitters that one neuron sends to the next neuron tell it to either pass the impulse or message along to the next cell or stop there. The impulse or message travels most smoothly down the axon from the cell body to the axon terminals when it is insulated by a fatty material called the myelin sheath. The axon serves as the pathway. The myelin sheath keeps the impulse on the path so it doesn't escape, and also helps the signal to move faster. The more insulated the axon is by the myelin sheath, the more accurately and quickly the message is sent. Think of this like a newly paved highway, making travel quicker and more efficient, allowing messages to make their way speedily without hitting a bump or veering off course from one neuron to the next. A newly paved highway accomplishes this much faster than traveling on a dirt road with potholes and covered with rocks. This is where gray and white matter come in. Gray matter makes up most of the parts of the neuron, except the myelin sheath. White matter is the myelin. It gets its name from the white fatty cells it is made up of. The growth of the gray matter peaks in early childhood, while the white matter continues to develop into early adulthood. The creation of connections between neurons is called synaptogenesis, or synapse formation. Neurons that communicate with each other more often form stronger connections across their synapses. Neurons need to connect with other neurons to perform a particular function, such as hearing or smelling something. These connections can cross short distances in the brain or very long distances across the brain, or still longer distances from the brain down the spinal cord. How does a neuron know which other neurons to connect with? A developing neuron responds to neurotransmitters and other signals in the environment, which help guide its path. Some neurons have specific functions. For example, the motor neurons in our bodies drive our muscles. As a child learns to crawl and walk, connections between neurons in the brain, the motor neurons in the body, and the muscles they target strengthen and grow, more efficient with practice. Other neurons, such as neurons in our eyes that sense light, or those in our noses that sense smells, fine-tune their connections based on the stimulation they receive from the environment. The same is true of neurons in the regions of the brain that process language and identify faces. As a child has experiences and receives sensory information from the environment, the brain fine-tunes connections between neurons that help us learn a language or identify a familiar face. The more often a child has a particular experience, the stronger the connections will be in her brain. This is true of both positive and negative experiences. For example, if an adult responds with eye contact and words when a baby coos, the connection in the brain that processes language are being strengthened. If a baby is shouted at every time she cries, the connections in her brain that process fear are strengthened, which means she is likely to expect to be shouted at and experience fear when she cries to communicate her needs. The experiences that children have affect the actual structure of their brain. In other words, brains are built through experience.